Nativism is the political position of demanding a favored status for certain established inhabitants of a nation as compared to claims of newcomers or immigrants. Nativism typically means opposition to immigration, and support of efforts to lower the political or legal status of specific ethnic or cultural groups who were considered hostile or alien to the natural culture, upon the assumption that they cannot be assimilated. According to Fetzer, opposition to immigration is common in many countries because of issues of national, cultural, and religious identity. The phenomenon has been studied especially in Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States, as well as Europe in recent years, where immigration is seen as lowering the wages of the less well-paid natives. Thus nativism has become a general term for opposition to immigration based on fears that the immigrants will distort or spoil existing cultural values. In situations where the nativistic movement exists inside of dominant culture, it tends to be associated with xenophobic and assimilationist projects. At the other end of the spectrum, in situations where immigrants greatly outnumber the original inhabitants or where contact forces economic and cultural change, nativistic movements can allow cultural survival. Among North American Indians, important nativist movements include Neolin, Tenskwatawa, and Wovoka. They held anti-white views, teaching that whites were morally inferior to the Indians and their ways must be rejected. Thus Tenskwatawa taught that the Americans were children of the evil spirit. In scholarly studies, nativism is a standard technical term. However, in public political discourse, nativist is a term of opprobrium usually used by the opposition, and rarely by nativists themselves. Anti-immigration is a more neutral term that may be used to characterize opponents of immigration. By country, nativism in the United States. As the direct result of written and broken treaties, catastrophic military failures, lack of competitive scientific and technological know-how, and of forced assimilation, the Indians were virtually destroyed by the European immigration that created the United States. In the United States, anti-immigration views have a long history. For a while Benjamin Franklin was hostile to Germans in colonial Pennsylvania. President John Adams in 1798 signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited the ability of immigrants, especially radicals from France and Ireland, to gain full political rights. This became a major political issue in the 1800 election. Nativism gained its name from the Native American parties. In this context, native does not mean indigenous or American Indian but rather those descended from the inhabitants of the original 13 colonies. It impacted politics in the mid-19th century because of the large inflows of immigrants from cultures that were somewhat different from the existing American culture. Thus, nativists objected primarily to Irish Roman Catholics because of their loyalty to the Pope and also because of their supposed rejection of republicanism as an American ideal. Nativist movements included the Know Nothing or American Party of the 1850s, the Immigration Restriction League of the 1890s, the anti-Asian movements in the West, resulting in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 by which Japan's government stopped emigration to the U.S. labor unions, were strong supporters of Chinese exclusion and limits on immigration, because of fears that they would lower wages and make it harder to organize unions. Historian Eric Kaufman has suggested that American nativism has been explained primarily in psychological and economic terms to the neglect of a crucial cultural and ethnic dimension. Furthermore, Kaufman claims American nativism cannot be understood without reference to an American ethnic group which took shape prior to the large-scale immigration of the mid-18th century. Anti-European nativism in the 17th century, from the very beginning, the process of European settlement of what would later become United States territory was accompanied by armed conflicts that periodically erupted between the natives and the settlers in the areas that were being colonized. The wars, which ranged from the 17th century, King Philip's War, King William's War, as well as Queen Anne's War, Tuscarora War, Yamasee War and Dumas War at the opening of the 18th century, French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion and Lord Dunmore's War after the middle of that century until the Wounded Knee Massacre and closing of the American frontier in 1890, generally resulted in the opening of Native American lands to further colonization, the conquest of Native Americans and their assimilation, or forced relocation to Indian reservations. Anti-Catholic nativism in the 19th century. Nativist outbursts occurred in the Northeast from the 1830s to the 1850s, primarily in response to a surge of Irish Catholic immigration. In 1836, Samuel Morse ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City on a nativist ticket, receiving 1,496 votes. In New York City, an Order of United Americans was founded as a nativist fraternity, following the Philadelphia nativist riots of the preceding spring and summer. In December 1844. In 1849 €50 Charles B. Allen founded a nativist society called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner in New York City. In order to join the order, a man had to be 21, a Protestant, a believer in God, and willing to obey without question the dictates of the order. Members of the order became known as the Know-Nothings. The Nativists went public in 1854 when they formed the American Party, which was especially hostile to the immigration of Irish Catholics and campaigned for laws to require longer wait time between immigration and naturalization. It was at this time that the term nativist first appears. Opponents denounced them as bigoted nativists. Former President Millard Fillmore ran on the American Party ticket for the presidency in 1856. The American Party also included many ex-Whigs who ignored nativism, and included a few Catholics whose families had long lived in America. Conversely, much of the opposition to Catholics came from Protestant Irish immigrants and German Lutheran immigrants who were not native at all and can hardly be called nativists. This form of nationalism is often identified with xenophobia and anti-Catholic sentiment. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, a nativist mob attacked and burned down a Catholic convent in 1834. In the 1840s, small-scale riots between Catholics and nativists took place in several American cities. In Philadelphia in 1844, for example, a series of nativist assaults on Catholic churches and community centers resulted in the loss of lives and the professionalization of the police force. In Louisville, Kentucky, Election Day rioters killed at least 22 people in attacks on German and Irish Catholics on August 6, 1855, in what became known as Bloody Monday. Nativist sentiment experienced a revival in the 1890s, led by Protestant Irish immigrants hostile to Catholic immigration. Anti-German nativism. From the 1840s to 1920, German Americans were distrusted because of their separatist social structure, their German language schools, their attachment to their native tongue over English, and their neutrality in World War I. The Bennett Law caused a political uproar in Wisconsin in 1890, as the state government passed a law that threatened to close down hundreds of German-language elementary schools. Catholic and Lutheran Germans rallied to defeat the leader of the nativists, the incumbent Republican governor, William D. Hord. Hord attacked German-American culture and religion. "We must fight alienism and selfish ecclesiasticism. The parents, the pastors and the church have entered into a conspiracy to darken the understanding of the children, who were denied by cupidity and bigotry the privilege of even the free schools of the state." Hord, a Republican, was defeated by the Democrats. A similar campaign in Illinois regarding the Edwards Law led to a Republican defeat there in 1890. In 1917 to 1918, a wave of nativist sentiment led to the suppression of German cultural activities in the United States, Canada and Australia. There was little violence, but many places and streets had their names changed, churches switched to English for their services, and German Americans were forced to buy war bonds to show their patriotism. In Australia, thousands of Germans were put into internment camps. See also, World War I anti-German sentiment, anti-Chinese nativism. In the 1870s in the western states, Irish American immigrants attacked Chinese immigrants, driving them out of smaller towns. Dennis Kearney led a mass movement in San Francisco in 1877 that threatened to harm railroad owners if they hired any people who were Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first of many nativist acts of Congress to limit the flow of immigrants into the U.S. The Chinese responded with false claims of American birth, enabling thousands to immigrate to California. The exclusion of the Chinese caused the Western railroads to begin importing Mexican railroad workers in greater numbers. 20th century, In the 1890 to 1920 era, nativists and labor unions campaigned for immigration restriction. A favorite plan was the literacy test to exclude workers who could not read or write their own foreign language. Congress passed literacy tests, but President Euro, responding to business needs for workers, Euro vetoed them. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge argued need for literacy tests and its implication on the new immigrants. It is found, in the first place, that the illiteracy test will bear most heavily upon the Italians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Greeks, and Asiatics, and lightly, or not at all, upon English-speaking emigrants, or Germans, Scandinavians, and French. In other words, the races most affected by the illiteracy test are those whose emigration to this country has begun within the last 20 years and swelled rapidly to enormous proportions, races with which the English-speaking people have never hitherto assimilated, and who are most alien to the great body of the people of the United States. Responding to these demands, opponents of the literacy test called for the establishment of an immigration commission to focus on immigration as a whole. The United States Immigration Commission, also known as the Dillingham Commission, was created and tasked with studying immigration and its effect on the United States. The findings of the commission further influenced immigration policy and upheld the concerns of the Nativist movement. Following World War I, nativists in the 1920s focused their attention on Catholics, Jews, and Southeastern Europeans and realigned their beliefs behind racial and religious nativism. The racial concern of the anti-immigration movement was linked closely to the eugenics movement that was sweeping the United States in the 1920s. Led by Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, nativists grew more concerned with the racial purity of the United States. In his book, Grant argued that the American racial stock was being diluted by the influx of new immigrants from the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Polish ghettos. The Passing of the Great Race reached wide popularity among Americans and influenced immigration policy in the 1920s. In the 1920s, a wide national consensus sharply restricted the overall inflow of immigrants, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe. The Second Ku Klux Klan, which flourished in the U.S. in the 1920s, used strong nativist rhetoric, but the Catholics led a counterattack. After intense lobbying from the Nativist movement, the United States Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921. This bill was the first to place numerical quotas on immigration. It capped the inflow of immigrations to 357,803 for those arriving outside of the Western Hemisphere. However, this bill was only temporary as Congress began debating a more permanent bill. The Emergency Quota Act was followed with the Immigration Act of 1924, a more permanent resolution. This law reduced the number of immigrants able to arrive from 357,803, the number established in the Emergency Quota Act, to 164,687. Though this bill did not fully restrict immigration, it considerably curbed the flow of immigration into the United States. During the late 1920s, an average of 270,000 immigrants were allowed to arrive, mainly because of the exemption of Canada and Latin American countries. Fear of low-skilled immigrants flooding the labor market was an issue in the 1920s, and in the first decade of the 21st century. An immigration reductionism movement formed in the 1970s and continues to the present day. Prominent members often press for massive, sometimes total, reductions in immigration levels. American nativist sentiment experienced a resurgence in the late 20th century, this time directed at illegal aliens, largely Mexican, resulting in the passage of new penalties against illegal immigration in 1996. Illegal immigration, principally from across the United States Mexico border, is the more pressing concern for most immigration reductionists. Authors such as Samuel Huntington have also seen recent Hispanic immigration as creating a national identity crisis and presenting insurmountable problems for U.S. social institutions. Language: American nativists have promoted English and deprecated the use of German and Spanish. English-only proponents in the late 20th century proposed an English language amendment, a constitutional amendment making English the official language of the United States, but have won little political support. Nativism in Brazil: Brazilian elites desired the racial whitening of the country, much as what happened in Argentina and Uruguay, so that it stimulated European immigration, but non-white immigration always faced huge backlash. On July 28, 1921, Representatives Andrade Bezerra and Cincinnato Braga proposed a law whose Article 1 provided, "The immigration of individuals from the black race to Brazil is prohibited." On October 22, 1923, Representative Fida Copyright Lees Reis produced another bill on the entry of immigrants, whose fifth article was as follows: "The entry of settlers from the black race into Brazil is prohibited. For Asian immigrants there will be allowed each year a number equal to 5% of those residing in the country." In the 19th and 20th centuries, there were negative feelings toward the communities of German, Japanese, Italian and Jewish immigrants, who conserved their language and culture instead of adopting Portuguese and Brazilian habit, were seen as particularly tendentious to form ghettos, had high rates of endogamy, among other concerns. It affected more harshly the Japanese, because they were Asian, and thus seen as an obstacle of the whitening of Brazil. Oliveira Viana, a Brazilian jurist, historian and sociologist, described the Japanese immigrants as follows: "They are like sulfur, insoluble." The Brazilian magazine O Malo in its edition of December 5, 1908 issued a charge of Japanese immigrants with the following legend: "The government of São Paulo is stubborn." After the failure of the first Japanese immigration, it contracted 3,000 yellow people. It insists on giving Brazil a race diametrically opposite to ours. In 1941, the Brazilian Minister of Justice, Francisco Campos, defended the ban on admission of 400 Japanese immigrants in São Paulo and wrote, "Their despicable standard of living is a brutal competition with the country's worker. Their selfishness, their bad faith, their refractory character, make them a huge ethnic and cultural cyst located in the richest regions of Brazil." Some years before World War II, the government of President Getulio Vargas initiated a process of forced assimilation of people of immigrant origin in Brazil. The Constitution of 1934 had a legal provision about the subject: the concentration of immigrants anywhere in the country is prohibited. The law should govern the selection, location and assimilation of the alien. The assimilationist project affected mainly German, Italian, Jewish, Japanese immigrants and their descendants. During the World War II they were seen as more loyal to their countries of origin than to Brazil. In fact, there were violent revolts in the Japanese community of the states of São Paulo and Parana when Emperor Hirohito declared that Japan surrendered and he was not a deity, which was thought as a conspiracy trying to hurt Japanese honor and strength. Nevertheless, it followed hostility from the government. The Japanese-Brazilian community was strongly marked by restrictive measures when Brazil declared war against Japan in August 1942. Japanese Brazilians could not travel the country without safe conduct issued by the police. Over 200 Japanese schools were closed and radio equipment was seized to prevent transmissions on shortwave from Japan. The goods of Japanese companies were confiscated and several companies of Japanese origin had interventions, including the newly founded Banco Arma Copyright Rica do Sul. Japanese Brazilians were prohibited from driving motor vehicles, buses or trucks on their property. The drivers employed by Japanese had to have permission from the police. Thousands of Japanese immigrants were arrested or expelled from Brazil on suspicion of espionage. There were many anonymous denunciations because of activities against national security arising from disagreements between neighbors, recovery of debts and even fights between children. Japanese Brazilians were arrested for suspicious activity, when they were in artistic meetings or picnics. On July 10, 1943, approximately 10,000 Japanese and German immigrants who lived in Santos had 24 hours to close their homes and businesses and move away from the Brazilian coast. The police acted without any notice. About 90% of people displaced were Japanese. To reside in Baixada Santista, the Japanese had to have a safe conduct. In 1942, the Japanese community who introduced the cultivation of pepper in Toma Copyright or Section U, in Para, was virtually turned into a concentration camp from which no Japanese could leave. This time, the Brazilian ambassador in Washington, D.C., Carlos Martins Pereira e Souza, encouraged the government of Brazil to transfer all the Japanese Brazilians to internment camps without the need for legal support, in the same manner as was done with the Japanese residents in the United States. No single suspicion of activities of Japanese against national security was confirmed. Nowadays, nativism in Brazil affects primarily migrants from elsewhere in the Third World, such as the new wave of Levantine Arabs, South and East Asians, Spanish speakers and Amerindians from neighboring South American countries and, especially, West Africans and Haitians. Following the 2010 Haiti earthquake and considerable illegal immigration to northern Brazil and São Paulo, a subsequent debate in the population was concerned with the reasons why Brazil has such lax laws and enforcement concerning illegal immigration. According to the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, it is an unbailable crime to address someone in an offensive racist way, and it is illegal to discriminate someone on the basis of his or her race, skin color, national or regional origin or nationality. Thus nativism and opposition to multiculturalism would be too much of a polemic and delicate topic to be openly discussed as a basic ideology of even the most right-leaning modern political parties. Nativism in Canada. Nativism was common in Canada. It took several forms. Hostility to the Chinese and other Asians was intense, and involved provincial laws that hindered immigration of Chinese and Japanese and blocked their economic mobility. In 1942 Japanese Canadians were forced into detention camps in response to Japanese aggression in World War II. Throughout the 19th century, well into the 20th, the Orange Order in Canada attacked and tried to politically defeat the Irish Catholics. The Ku Klux Klan spread in the mid-1920s from the U.S. to parts of Canada, especially Saskatchewan, where it helped topple the Liberal government. The Klan creed was, historian Martin Robin argues, in the mainstream of Protestant Canadian sentiment, for it was based on Protestantism, separation of church and state, pure patriotism, restrictive and selective immigration, one national public school, one flag and one language, English. In World War I, Canadian naturalized citizens of German or Austrian origins were stripped of their right to vote, and tens of thousands of Ukrainians were rounded up and put in internment camps. Hostility of native-born Canadians to competition from English immigrants in the early 20th century was expressed in signs that read, "No English need apply." The resentment came because the immigrants identified more with England than with Canada. Still today, there are many Canadians with long Canadian heritages who have mixed feelings over recent immigration. In the British Empire, traditions of anti-Catholicism in Britain led to fears that Catholics were a threat to the national values. In Canada, the Orange Order campaigned vigorously against the Catholics throughout the 19th century, often with violent confrontations. Both sides were immigrants from Ireland and neither side claimed loyalty to Canada. The Orange Order was much less influential in the U.S., especially after a major riot in New York City in 1871. Canada was racked by conflicts between the Anglophones and Francophones over language. The Irish Catholics were on the same side as the Protestant nativists in opposing the expansion of French culture. Nativism in Australia. The impact of Europeans was disruptive to the hunter-gatherer way of life of the Aboriginal nomads, and this sometimes led to skirmishes, although never to large-scale warfare. In contrast to the Zulu Wars in South Africa or the Maori Wars in New Zealand, there were no Aboriginal wars in Australia. At the same time, some settlers were quite aware they were often usurping Aboriginal land. In 1845, settler Charles Griffith sought to justify this, writing, "The question comes to this. Which has the better right, the savage, born in a country, which he runs over but can scarcely be said to occupy? Or the civilized man, who comes to introduce into this unproductive country, the industry which supports life?" There were occasional incidents as settlers and pastoralists attempted to establish their presence and Aborigines sought to preserve their way of life. In May 1804, at Risdon Cove, Van Diemen's Land, perhaps 60 Aborigines were killed when they approached the town. Many Australians opposed the influx of Chinese immigrants at time of the 19th century gold rushes. When the separate Australian colonies formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, the new nation adopted White Australia as one of its founding principles. Under the White Australia policy, entry of Chinese and other Asians remained controversial until well after World War II, although the country remained home to many long-established Chinese families dating from before the adoption of White Australia. By contrast, most Pacific Islanders were deported soon after the policy was adopted, while the remainder were forced out of the sugar fields where they had worked for decades. Hostility of native-born white Australians toward British and Irish immigrants in the late 19th century was manifested in a new party, the Australian Natives Association. Since early 2000, opposition has mounted to asylum seekers arriving in boats from Indonesia. Nativism in New Zealand. The New Zealand Wars, sometimes called the Land Wars and also once called the Maori Wars, were a series of armed conflicts that took place in New Zealand between 1845 and 1872. The wars were fought over a number of issues, the most prominent concerning Maori land being sold to the settler population. Nativism in Taiwan. Nativism flourished in Taiwan in the 1970s as a reaction against the influx of mainland Chinese to the island after the Kuomintang's defeat in 1949. Nativists felt that the political influence of mainland Chinese was disproportionately large. The term is especially found in the field of literature, where nativist literature was more traditionally minded than the modernist literature written largely by mainland Chinese. Nativism in Europe. London was notorious for its xenophobia in the 16th century, and conditions worsened in the 1580s. Many immigrants became disillusioned by routine threats of violence and molestation, attempts at expulsion of foreigners, and the great difficulty in acquiring English citizenship. Dutch cities proved more hospitable, and many left London permanently. Regarding the Irish in 20th century Great Britain, Lucassen argues the deep religious divide between the Protestants and Catholics was at the core of the ongoing estrangement of the Irish in British society. For the Poles in the mining districts of Western Germany before 1914, it was nationalism, which kept Polish workers, who had established an associational structure approaching institutional completeness, separate from the host German society. Lucassen found that religiosity and nationalism were more fundamental in generating nativism and intergroup hostility than the labor antagonism. Once Italian workers in France had understood the benefit of unionism and French unions were willing to overcome their fear of Italians as scabs, integration was open for most Italian immigrants. The French state, which was always more of an immigration state than Prussia, Germany or Great Britain, fostered and supported family-based immigration and thus helped Italians on their immigration trajectory with minimal nativism. Many observers see the post-1950s wave of immigration in Europe was fundamentally different from the pre-1914 patterns. They debate the role of cultural differences, ghettos, race, Muslim fundamentalism, poor education and poverty play in creating nativism among the hosts and a caste-type underclass, more similar to white-black tensions in the U.S. Algerian migration to France has generated nativism, characterized by the prominence of Jean-Marie Le Pen and his National Front. Anti-immigration arguments. Anti-immigration sentiment is typically justified with one or more of the following arguments and claims about immigrants: government expense. Government expenses may exceed tax revenue relating to new immigrants. Language. Isolate themselves in their own communities and refuse to learn the local language. Employment, acquire jobs which would have otherwise been available to native citizens, suppressing wages. Patriotism, damage a sense of community and nationality. Environment, increase the consumption of scarce resources. Their move from low to high pollution economy increases pollution. Welfare, make heavy use of social welfare systems. Overpopulation, may overpopulate countries. Culture, can swamp a native population and replace its culture with their own. Housing, increase in housing costs, migrant families can reduce vacancies and cause rent increases. The claim that immigrants can swamp a local population is related to birth rate relative to nationals. Contemporary opponents of immigration blame it for such problems as unemployment, crime, harm to the environment, housing shortage, and overwhelming social services such as hospitals, police. See also, anti-Catholicism, criticism of multiculturalism, hyphenated American, illegal immigration to the United States, immigration to the United States, immigration reduction, immigration reform, Kiranisation, list of organizations designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center as hate groups, national conservatism, political demography, rivers of blood speech, xenophobia, notes. References and bibliography, comparative, Alex Sieve, Mikhail A. Immigration Phobia and the Security Dilemma, Russia, Europe, and the United States. 294 pp. Art, David. Inside the Radical Right, The Development of Anti-Immigrant Parties in Western Europe 288 pages. Examines anti-immigration activists and political candidates in 11 countries. Jensen, Richard. Comparative Nativism, The United States, Canada and Australia, 1880s-1910s, Canadian Journal for Social Research Vol 3 No. 1 pages 45–55, United States, Alefelt, Christopher. Race, Radicalism, Religion, and Restriction, Immigration in the Pacific Northwest, 1890–1924. Praeger, 2003. 235 pp. Ambinder, Tyler. Nativism and Prejudice Against Immigrants, in A Companion to American Immigration, ed. by Reed Weeder pages 177–201 online excerpt, Barkan, Elliot R. Return of the Nativists? California Public Opinion and Immigration in the 1980s and 1990s. Social Science History 2003 27, 2, 229–283. ISSN 0145-5532 Full text, in Project Muse, Franchot, Jenny. Roads to Rome, The Antebellum Protestant Encounter with Catholicism, Hyam, John, Strangers in the Land, Patterns of American Nativism, 1860–1925, The Standard Scholarly History, Hugh Eston, Robert Francis. The Catholic Press and Nativism, 1840–1860, High, Matthew W. Show Me Your Papers. Obama Unregistered Trademark S. Birth in the Whiteness of Belonging. Qualitative Sociology 35, 2, 163–181, Kaufman, Eric. American Exceptionalism Reconsidered, Anglo-Saxon Ethnogenesis and the Universal Nation, 1776–1850, Journal of American Studies, 33, 3, pp. 437–457. Luke, Frederick C. Bonds of Loyalty, German Americans and World War I. Schrag Peter. Not Fit for Our Society, Immigration and Nativism in America 256 pages. Canada, Houston, Cecil J. and Smith, William J. The Sash-Canada War, A Historical Geography of the Orange Order in Canada U of Toronto Press, 1980. McLaughlin, Robert. Irish Nationalism and Orange Unionism in Canada, A Reappraisal, A Permil Ireland 41.3 and 480–109, McLean, Lorna. To Become Part of Us Ethnicity, Race, Literacy and the Canadian Immigration Act of 1919 inches. Canadian Ethnic Studies 2004 36, 2, 1–28. ISSN 0008-3496, Miller, J. R. Equal Rights, The Jesuits Unregistered Trademark Estates Act Controversy. In late 19c Canada, Palmer, Howard. Patterns of Prejudice, A History of Nativism in Alberta, Robin, Martian. Shades of Right, Nativist and Fascist Politics in Canada, 1920–1940. C. S. W. Riots in New Brunswick, Orange Nativism and Social Violence in the 1840s. Ward, W. Peter. White Canada Forever, Popular Attitudes and Public Policy Toward Orientals in British Columbia, Other Countries, Betts, Hans-Georg. Against the Green Totalitarianism, Anti-Islamic Nativism and Contemporary Radical Right-Wing Populism in Western Europe, in Christina Shari Liang, ed. Europe for the Europeans, C. Uppens, Bambi. Allochthons, Colonizers, and Scroungers, Exclusionary Populism in Belgium, African Studies Review, Volume 49, Number 2, September 2006, ppA 147 a €186 doi, 10.1353/ARW. 2006.0102 Allochthons means giving welfare benefits only to those groups that are considered to truly belong. Chin, Jeff, and Robert Kaiser, eds. Russians as the New Minority, Ethnicity and Nationalism in the Soviet Successor States, FINZSCH, Norbert, and Dietmar Schermer, eds. Identity and Intolerance, Nationalism, Racism, and Xenophobia in Germany and the United States, Groenfeld, D. The Future of Indigenous Values, Cultural Relativism in the Face of Economic Development, Futures, Volume 35, Issue 9, November 2003, pages 917 to 929, Lucassen, Leo. The Immigrant Threat, the Integration of Old and New Migrants in Western Europe since 1850. University of Illinois Press, 2005. 280 pp. ISBN 0-252-07294-4. Examines Irish immigrants in Britain, Polish immigrants in Germany, Italian immigrants in France, and Caribbeans in Britain, Turks in Germany, and Algerians in France. Liang, Christina Shurry, ed. Europe for the Europeans, McNally, Mark. Proving the Way, Conflict and Practice in the History of Japanese Nativism, Mamdani, M. When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and the Genocide in Rwanda, Rose, Richard. The End of Consensus in Austria and Switzerland, Journal of Democracy, Volume 11, Number 2, April 2000, ppA 26 €40, Wertheimer, Jack. Unwelcome Strangers, East European Jews in Imperial Germany, External links, Dennis Kearney, Henry A. Rhodes, Nativist and Racist Movements in the U.S. and Their Aftermath, Dennis Kearney, President, and H. L. Knight, Secretary, Appeal from California. The Chinese Invasion. Workingman a unregistered trademark S address, Indianapolis Times, February 28, 1878. A Nation or Notion, by Patrick J. Buchanan, op-ed, October 4, 2006. A Conservative Defense of Nativism. PoliticosLatinos.com Videos of 2008 U.S. presidential election candidates' positions regarding immigration, anti-immigration groups and the masks of false diversity. False diversity in anti-immigration organizations. A Defense of Nativism, Conservative Heritage Times.